There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the palace of Versailles after the last tourists have gone home. The great golden gates close, the gravel paths empty, the fountains, which spent all day leaping and catching the light in great arching curtains of white water, fall slowly still. And in that stillness, in the long blue hour between afternoon and dark, the palace becomes something else entirely. It becomes what it always was beneath the ceremony and the spectacle, a building full of rooms, rooms full of memory, stone walls that absorbed 2 centuries of whispered conversations, of slippered footsteps on parquet floors, of candles burning down to nothing in silver holders while someone lay awake listening to the wind move through the gardens below. Tonight, we are going to step inside those rooms together, slowly, without hurry. We are not going to rush through the gilded halls the way a tour guide might, rattling off dates and dimensions. We are going to walk softly, the way you walk through a place that deserves your attention. We are going to let the details settle around us like dust in old light. The story we are following belongs to a young woman who arrived here when she was 14 years old, who spent nearly 2 decades inside these walls, and whose name has been repeated and misunderstood and romanticized and demonized ever since. She was not the monster her enemies made her. She was not the saint her admirers would sometimes like her to be. She was something far more interesting than either. She was a real person, caught in an impossible position, doing her imperfect best in a world that had decided long before she arrived exactly what she was supposed to be. Her name was Marie Antoinette, and this is the story of her life inside the most extraordinary building in the world. Let the lights in your room grow dim. Let your breathing slow just a little. There is nothing you need to do tonight but rest and listen. Outside, if you imagine it, the gardens of Versailles are cooling in the dark. The long reflecting pools lie flat and silver under the early stars. The hedges, clipped into perfect geometric walls of green, cast their precise shadows across the pale gravel. An owl moves somewhere in the older trees at the far edge of the park, where the formal order of the gardens gives way to something wilder and more honest. The palace itself glows faintly, the way all large pale stone buildings glow in the hours after sunset, holding the warmth of the day in their pale limestone faces, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. The Hall of Mirrors is dark now. 757 mirrors hang along its length, and during the day they catch the light from 73 arched windows and multiply it into something overwhelming, something almost aggressive in its brightness. But in the dark, they do the opposite. They gather the shadows and deepen them, and the room becomes a long, quiet corridor of infinite reflection, of depth within depth, of dark inside dark. This is the building she called home. This is the building that made her and unmade her. We are going to walk through it together, from her earliest days here
to her last. We are going to follow her through the morning ceremonies and the garden evenings, through the fashion and the gossip and the loneliness, through the small escapes she carved for herself in the trees beyond the main palace, through the crisis that cracked everything open, and through the long, slow final chapter that ended not here, but in the noise and terror of a Paris street. But we begin here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the palace at dusk. Settle in. Close your eyes if you like, or let them grow heavy. There is no rush tonight. History, when it is told slowly, has a way of becoming almost like sleep itself, something you drift through rather than march through, something that carries you gently from one soft moment to the next. Let us begin. Before we go any further, if this kind of slow, peaceful history helps you find sleep, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. I have been working on Hio for over a year now, spending hours researching and writing and recording each of these stories, and the channel still only has around 160 subscribers. Every single one of those subscribers genuinely means something to me. If you have been listening for a while without subscribing, tonight might be the night. It takes 1 second, and it helps more than you know. Now, back to Versailles. Section 2. A child in Vienna, before France knew her name. She was born on November the 2nd, 1755, in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and from the very first day of her life, almost nothing about her belonged entirely to her. Her full name, the name she was given at birth and which filled an entire page of the registry, was Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. She was the 15th child of Holy Roman Emperor Francis I and Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, which meant she entered the world into one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, and also into a household that already had 14 other children competing for attention, resources, and the political usefulness that royal children represented in the 18th century. To her family, she was called Antoine. To the French court she would later inhabit, she would become Marie Antoinette. But in those early years in Vienna, she was simply a cheerful, fair-haired little girl with blue-grey eyes and a quick laugh, growing up in a palace that was rather less formal than Versailles would turn out to be, in a family that was, by royal standards, unusually warm. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was one of the most formidable women of the age. She had inherited an empire at 23, had fought off multiple rival claims to her throne, had survived wars, had raised 16 children while simultaneously governing a vast and complicated kingdom, and had done all of this with a combination of iron will, sharp intelligence, and a genuine personal warmth that was entirely real and entirely strategic in equal measure. She loved her children. She also used her children as diplomatic currency, which was simply the world she inhabited, and she made no particular apology for it. Antoine grew up alongside brothers and sisters in the relaxed, comparatively informal atmosphere of the Habsburg court. The children played together, They put on theatrical performances. They were taught music. Mozart, who was 6 years older than Antoine, performed for the imperial family when he was 6 years old and she was 5. And there are accounts of the little archduchess charming the young prodigy, and he, apparently, proposing marriage to her in that artless, theatrical way that very small children sometimes do. It is one of those details that history preserves because it is so entirely innocent and so quietly ironic, given what her marriage would eventually mean. Her education was, to put it gently, inconsistent. The Habsburg approach to educating daughters leaned more toward the social arts than the academic ones. She was taught to dance, and she danced beautifully. She was taught to play the harpsichord and the harp. She learned enough French to get by, and some Italian, and her German was obviously native. But Latin was a struggle, mathematics was neglected, and the rigorous intellectual formation that her mother had given herself through years of determined self-study was not really passed down to her daughters with the same urgency. Antoine read lightly. She wrote slowly. She preferred people to books, movement to stillness, music to silence. None of this was particularly unusual for an aristocratic girl of the time. What was slightly unusual was how thoroughly her governess managed to shield her from the full weight of her educational shortcomings. When the Empress eventually sent an emissary to assess her daughter's readiness for the French match, he came back with a report that was, diplomatically speaking, not entirely encouraging. She was charming, she was lovely, she was not, he noted carefully, as prepared as she might be. Maria Theresa was not pleased. But the match was proceeding regardless, because the match was important. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty of Austria and the Bourbon dynasty of France had been enemies, rivals, adversaries, the great opposing powers of European politics. The alliance sealed in 1756, known as the Diplomatic Revolution, had fundamentally redrawn the map of European allegiances, and Antoine's marriage to the French Dauphin was meant to cement that new friendship, to stitch it into place with a royal union that made the two dynasties not just allies, but family. A 14-year-old girl was the thread. Her last months in Vienna, before the departure for France in 1770, were a rush of preparation. New tutors arrived, languages were rehearsed, court etiquette was drilled, though the etiquette of Vienna and the etiquette of Versailles would turn out to be so different that much of what she learned had to be unlearned. She was given a new wardrobe, though this too would be stripped away at the border. She said goodbye to her sisters, her brothers, her rooms, her dogs. She said goodbye to Vienna, which she would never see again. She was 14 years old. She was going to France to marry a boy she had never met, to live in a country whose customs she barely understood, to become eventually its queen. She left on the 21st of April, 1770, in a procession of 57 carriages, and turned her face toward a country that did not yet know what to do with her. What she carried with her
besides the official portraits and the formal letters and the chest of Austrian clothing she would never wear again, was harder to name. She carried her mother's voice in her ear, the constant letters that would follow her to France, instructing and advising and occasionally scolding. She carried that lightness that people who knew her always described, that quality of easy warmth and impulsive kindness that made people love her quickly. She carried the habits of a girl who had grown up among siblings, who preferred laughter to formality, who reached for friendship the way other people reached for safety. She also carried, though she could not know it yet, a kind of fundamental incompatibility with the place she was going. Not because she was bad or weak or foolish, but because she was herself, a genuinely sociable, slightly impatient, emotionally open young woman. And Versailles was a machine that required something else entirely. Versailles required performance. It required patience. It required the ability to live entirely in public without ever showing anything that could be used against you. She was not built for that, and that, more than anything else, is the beginning of the story. Section 3. The Journey into France. Crossing the border.
The ceremony happened on a small island in the middle of the Rhine River, in a specially constructed wooden pavilion that had been built for exactly this moment and would be dismantled immediately after. The island sat between the French bank and the German bank of the river, equidistant between two worlds belonging to neither, and this was deliberate. The location was chosen because what was about to happen needed to happen in neutral space, in a place that was not quite Austria anymore and not quite France yet, a threshold moment that needed its own threshold geography. On the Austrian side of the pavilion, Antoine entered. On the French side, Marie Antoinette emerged. The process was extraordinarily thorough. Every item of Austrian clothing was removed. Every piece of jewellery that had come from Vienna was set aside. Even her Austrian underwear, a detail that strikes modern readers as both absurd and quietly brutal, was replaced with French-made garments. Austrian ladies-in-waiting were left behind. French ones stepped forward to take their places. The Austrian dogs she had brought with her were taken back to Vienna. The Austrian documents she had carried were transferred into French hands. Everything that had been Antoine, everything that had belonged to the Archduchess of Austria, was symbolically stripped away and left on the German bank of the river. What remained, stepping out onto the French side of the pavilion, was a 14-year-old girl in French clothes, surrounded by French strangers, on her way to a French palace to marry a French boy she had never spoken to.
She reportedly wept when she said goodbye to her Austrian ladies. The French attendants who replaced them were not unkind, but they were strangers, and she was 14, and the river was behind her now, and there was nothing to do but go forward. The journey across France took several weeks, and the French countryside received her with something that felt genuinely warm. Crowds gathered along the roads to see the Austrian princess who was going to become their Dauphine. She was beautiful. Her portraits from this period show a girl of real loveliness,
fair-skinned and fine-featured, with that particular quality of easy grace that makes people in crowds feel as though a famous person has made eye contact specifically with them. She waved, she smiled, she leaned from the carriage window and let the French public begin to construct their idea of her. She was young enough that the performance came naturally, without the self-consciousness that would develop later. The entry into Paris on May 16, 1770, was one of the great spectacles of the era. The city had been preparing for weeks. Streets were decorated, fountains flowed with wine. Fireworks had been prepared for that evening at the Place Louis XV, the wide open square along the Seine that would, less than 25 years later, be renamed the Place de la Révolution and serve a very different purpose. For now it was festive, crowded, joyful. The people of Paris pressed forward to see her.
The official marriage ceremony took place at Versailles the following day. Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France, was 15 years old, a year older than his new bride. He was tall for his age, slightly heavy, with a round face, and a manner that tended toward the awkward when he was nervous, which on his wedding day he clearly was. He was shy in the way that genuinely introverted people are shy. Not painfully so, not offensively so, but with a quality of careful withdrawal that made him seem less present in a room than he actually was. They were married in the royal chapel at Versailles, a building of such architectural beauty that even the 14-year-old girl who had grown up in palaces looked up at it with wide eyes. The ceremony lasted for hours, in the way that royal ceremonies always did, freighted with ritual and formality, and the watching eyes of several hundred courtiers who had nothing better to do that day than observe every detail of the new Dauphin's composure and report it to everyone they knew. That night there was the ritual bedding. Both sets of families, or rather both courts, participated in escorting the young couple to the marriage bed, standing around it while prayers were said and blessings given, and the curtains were eventually mercifully drawn. This was an ancient custom, rooted in the need to establish witnesses to a royal marriage's consummation, and it was one of many Versailles traditions that Marie Antoinette would describe to her mother with a mixture of bewilderment and very dry humour.
Nothing happened behind those curtains. Not that night, and not for quite some time thereafter. The marriage would not be consummated for 7 years, for reasons that have been debated by historians ever since, and that belong to a later part of this story. What matters for now is simply that 2 very young people lay in their royal bed in the world's most famous palace, surrounded by the rustling withdrawal of courtiers and the hush of an enormous house settling into its nighttime rhythms, and were utterly, completely strangers to each other. Outside the windows, if they had looked, the great gardens of Versailles would have been lit by the torches of the departing guests, and beyond the torchlight, the dark, the fountains, the long gravel paths, the clipped hedges standing in their perfect rows, and the sky above all of it, the French sky, which had nothing to do with either of them, and would be there long after both were gone. She was 14 years old. She was the Dauphine of France. She was also, in the deepest sense of the word, alone. Section 4. Versailles Unveiled, a palace that swallowed a girl. The Palace of Versailles, when it was built by Louis XIV in the second half of the 17th century, was designed to do something very specific. It was designed to make people feel small.
Not in a mean way, precisely. Not with cruelty as its motivating principle, but with the conscious, deliberate intention of creating an environment so vast, so lavish, so saturated with the symbols of royal power, that anyone who entered it would feel in their very bones the weight and grandeur of the French monarchy bearing down on them. Louis XIV understood something fundamental about power, that people need to be able to see it. Power that operates invisibly, behind closed doors, in private conversations. That kind of power is always vulnerable. Power that fills an entire horizon, that walks down a corridor 200 meters long while 500 people press forward to watch. That kind of power is something else. That kind of power becomes almost like weather. Something you live inside, not something you merely observe. The palace that Marie Antoinette arrived in at 14 was the result of decades of construction, expansion, and elaborate decoration, and it was extraordinary by any measure you care to apply. The main building ran along a facade of roughly 670 meters, which is almost 2/3 of a kilometer of ornate stone, gilt iron, and symmetrically arranged windows. Inside, there were approximately 700 rooms. There were 2,000 windows. There were 1,200 fireplaces. The hall of mirrors alone, that long gallery along the western face of the palace that has become the building's most famous interior, stretched for 73 meters, lined on one side by 357 mirrors and on the other by 17 arched windows looking out over the gardens. The ceiling of the Hall of Mirrors was covered entirely in painted allegories of the military victories of Louis XIV, and the chandeliers that hung from it were made of solid gold and crystal, and held thousands of candles, which when all lit together produced a light so intense that visitors described it as being like standing inside a sunbeam. And the gardens. The gardens deserve their own chapter, and they will get one later. For now, simply know that they extended for more than 800 hectares behind the palace, stretching away in long formal geometries of clipped hedges and reflecting pools and marble statuary, until they gave way at the far edges to the old forests of Ile-de-France. The Grand Canal alone, that long straight arm of water that extended from the garden's central axis, was 1,670 meters long, wide enough that Louis XIV had once kept a small fleet of gondolas and gondoliers on it, shipped from Venice at considerable expense. This was the place Marie Antoinette arrived in at 14, coming from a court that was grand, but not remotely this grand, from a family that was warm and occasionally informal, from a world that had, at least occasionally, let her breathe. She wrote to her mother about it. She wrote frequently, all her life, to her mother. The letters between Maria Theresa in Vienna and her daughter at Versailles form one of the most fascinating historical correspondences of the century, ranging from the warmly personal to the bluntly instructional, sometimes both within the same paragraph. In those early letters, you can feel the girl trying to manage her own bewilderment, trying to describe a world she barely had the vocabulary for yet. The palace was not only large, it was also never quiet, never empty, never private. Versailles was not simply the royal residence, it was the centre of the entire French government, the permanent home of the royal court, and the place where the nobility of France came to live, work, scheme, and compete for the favour of the crown. At any given time, approximately 3,000 nobles and 6,000 servants lived within the palace complex. Another 10,000 or so lived in the buildings and apartments immediately adjacent to it, in the town that had grown up around the palace over the previous century.
This meant that the palace was always full, always watched. There were courtiers in the antechambers at dawn and courtiers in the corridors at midnight. There were people whose entire purpose at Versailles was to watch and report. Not spies exactly, but something adjacent to spies. People whose social standing depended on their ability to produce interesting information about the royal family and deliver it to the right ears. What the Queen had for breakfast, whether the King had slept in his wife's bed last night, whether she had seemed melancholy or cheerful at the midday promenade. All of this was observed, noted, discussed, and eventually written down and passed around. For a girl who had grown up in a comparatively relaxed household, who had played freely with her siblings and run in gardens without anyone watching, the transition to this particular fishbowl was genuinely difficult. In one of her earliest letters home, she described the feeling of never being alone, not in a dramatic way, not with obvious distress, but with a careful, matter-of-fact quality that is somehow more affecting. She could not walk from one room to another without an entourage. She could not sit down to read without ladies arranging themselves around her. She could not eat, dress, pray, walk, sleep, or wake without it being, in some technical sense, a public act.
And yet she adapted. Not immediately, not entirely, not without cost. But she was 14, and 14-year-olds are capable of a remarkable flexibility when the alternative is not adapting at all. She learned the rhythms of the palace. She learned which corridors offered a moment of relative quiet, which corners of the garden were less frequented, which hours of the day allowed a sliver of something approaching solitude. She began, slowly and carefully, to build a life inside this impossible place. She never stopped feeling the weight of it,
but she learned, as people do, to carry it. Section 5. The morning ritual, the levee and the performance of royalty. Every morning at Versailles began with a ceremony, and the ceremony began before the Queen was even fully awake. It was called the levee, from the French word for rising, and it was one of the most elaborate and, by modern standards, most baffling rituals in the entire theatrical production that was life at the French court. The levee was not simply the process of getting out of bed and putting on clothes. It was a structured public performance with a strict hierarchy of participants, each of whom had earned or inherited the right to be present at a specific stage of the Queen's awakening, and who guarded that right with a ferocity that might strike a modern observer as disproportionate, but which made complete sense in the context of Versailles, where proximity to the royal body was the most valuable currency in circulation.
The process began with what was called the petit lever, the small rising. A handful of the Queen's most senior ladies would enter her bedchamber quietly, without yet drawing back the curtains. The First Lady of the bedchamber, or in her absence the lady in waiting currently on duty, would approach the royal bed and gently rouse the sleeping Queen. Not by shaking her, not by speaking loudly, but with a careful and delicate signal that the morning had arrived and that the machinery of the day was about to begin. Then came the washing. A basin of water was brought. Specific designated ladies were responsible for specific elements of this. The hierarchy of who was allowed to perform which intimate service for the Queen's person had been established over generations and encoded into the formal regulations of the court. There was a correct person to hand the Queen her shift, a correct person to hold the water basin, a correct person to offer the towel. If a more senior lady arrived while a lower-ranking lady was performing one of these services, the item, the shift, the towel, the water glass would be passed upward. Not because this made the practical process any more efficient, but because rank was rank, and rank had to be performed every hour of every day, or it ceased to mean anything.
Marie Antoinette described this ritual to her mother in a letter written early in her time at Versailles, and the tone of it is worth noting. She did not describe it as barbarous or degrading. She had been raised in a world that understood formal ceremony and its purposes, but she noted its quality of structured absurdity with a dry, clear-eyed wit that her mother, reading the letter in Vienna, would have recognized as her daughter's particular voice. She wrote that at 11 in the morning she had her hair done. At noon, all the world could enter. She wrote about putting on her rouge and washing her hands in front of the whole world. The phrase she used, tout le monde, the whole world. Simultaneously the French phrase for everyone, and also a kind of private joke, a gentle deflation of the whole magnificent, elaborate production. The grand levee, which followed the petite levee, opened the bedchamber doors to a much wider audience. Courtiers who had been waiting in the antechambers, sometimes for hours, depending on the season and the Queen's schedule, were admitted according to their rank. They were permitted to observe the Queen being dressed, to be acknowledged by her, to exchange brief words if protocol allowed.
being ignored during the levee was a social disaster. Being acknowledged, a glance, a nod, a word, was a social triumph worth reporting to everyone you knew.
The process of dressing was equally elaborate. The Queen wore stays and petticoats, and a robe. There were formal robes for public occasions, and more relaxed ones for the private apartments, though even the most relaxed gown by Versailles standards would have seemed extraordinary almost anywhere else in France. The dressing followed its own hierarchy of service, and there was a famous incident, recorded by multiple witnesses, in which the ceremony briefly broke down because of a technical point of aristocratic precedence. The story goes like this. The Queen was waiting to receive her chemise, her undergarment, which was to be handed to her by a specific lady of appropriate rank. That lady was in the act of presenting it when a senior duchess entered the room. Protocol required that the chemise be passed to the duchess as the more senior person present. As the duchess reached for it, another princess of the blood entered, ranking still higher. The chemise was passed again. The Queen stood waiting, in various states of undress, depending on which version of the story you read, while the garment travelled up the hierarchy. She apparently held out her hands and smiled at the delay, with that expression that people who knew her recognized, a smile that was patient and amused on the surface, and contained underneath a very clear awareness of the absurdity of what was happening. She was never entirely graceless about it. That was one of her genuine gifts, a quality of social ease, of being able to move through even ridiculous formal situations without losing the thread of her own dignity. But she found the ceremonies draining in a way that she expressed privately and never publicly. The performance was relentless. There was no off switch. And for a person of her temperament, warm, impulsive, preferring the spontaneous to the scripted, the daily requirement to be always, without exception, on stage, took something from her that she spent considerable energy trying to recover in her private hours. After the levee came Mass. The Queen, followed by her full entourage, would process from her apartments to the royal chapel, through corridors lined with watching courtiers, many of whom had been waiting since early morning simply to be present in the gallery and catch a glimpse of the royal procession passing below. Mass itself was another performance within the performance, the Queen praying in full public view, her demeanour observed, her attention noted. And then the midday meal, the grand couvert, at which the King and Queen dined together in full public view, seated at their table, while courtiers and the occasional curious visitor pressed forward to watch them eat. Marie Antoinette mentioned in another letter to her mother that dinner was over by 1:30 because they both ate very quickly. You can hear in that small detail both the good-humoured efficiency of two young people who simply wanted to get through the performance, and the slightly absurd reality that even eating, one of the most fundamentally private human activities, had been turned at Versailles into a spectacle requiring an audience. This was her morning, every morning, without exception. From the day she arrived
until the day the palace fell. If you walk through the Queen's state apartments at Versailles today, you walk through 4 connected rooms that are among the most ornate surviving spaces in all of Europe. The first room you enter is the Queen's Guard Room, where armed soldiers kept watch around the clock, and where the most important distinction of all, who was and was not permitted to approach the Queen, was physically enforced. Beyond it is the first antechamber, and then the second antechamber, called the Salon of the Bullseye, for the oval window set above its door. These antechambers were waiting rooms in the most elaborate possible sense, spaces where courtiers could linger, be seen, and hope to catch the Queen's attention as she moved between her official rooms. And then there is the Queen's chamber itself. It is a room of white and gold. The ceiling is painted with allegories, the seasons, the virtues, the symbols of abundance and royalty, all rendered in the slightly aggressive style of French Baroque decoration, where everything that could be gilded has been gilded, and the spaces between the gilded things have been filled with more gilded things. The fireplace is marble, with heavy bronze fittings. The walls are covered in silk, replaced multiple times during Marie Antoinette's years here, according to her changing tastes, until by the 1780s they were hung in a fabric of her own design, white and gold with flowers, delicate and fresh against all the ancestral grandeur of the room.
The bed is the bed's centerpiece, a 4-poster structure of almost architectural scale, with a canopy of embroidered fabric and curtains that could be drawn to create a small enclosed world within the larger room, except that the curtains were rarely drawn in private, because this room, this bed, was not private. The Queen slept here in a technical sense, though she often moved to her inner rooms to actually rest. But the room itself functioned more like a stage set than a bedroom. It was the room where life's great public moments happened. It was here that the Queen received formal visitors of state. Here that she went into labour in the full and documented presence of witnesses. The births of royal children at Versailles were, by ancient tradition, semi-public events. The room would fill with courtiers crowding forward to establish their presence at a historic moment. For Marie Antoinette's first labour in December 1778, the crowd in the room was so large and so pressing that the windows had to be broken open by servants to let in air, because the Queen was on the verge of losing consciousness from the heat and the crush of bodies. She fainted. She was revived, and her daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, was born safely. But the image, the Queen collapsing in her own birthing room from the pressure of too many spectators, captures something essential about what it meant to inhabit these apartments.
Behind the state apartments, accessed through a series of carefully controlled doors, were the private apartments. These were smaller, lower-ceilinged, less formally decorated, though less formal at Versailles still meant considerable elegance by any other standard. The private rooms were where Marie Antoinette could approach something like actual privacy.
The library, the small sitting room, the inner bedchamber where she often slept when the state bedroom felt too exposed. These rooms she decorated herself, and the decoration tells you something about her genuine taste. Lighter, more delicate, more floral than the heavy staterooms. Soft blues and greens, floral motifs, comfortable chairs arranged for conversation rather than ceremony. Bookshelves she actually used, a harpsichord. It was in these private rooms that she spent her evenings when the formal day was done. Small, trusted circles of friends gathered here. There was music. She played and sang, and she genuinely loved both. There were card games, light gambling that she could ill afford and indulged in anyway. There was conversation, which she had a real talent for, a quick wit, good instincts for what people wanted to discuss, and that quality of focused attention that makes people feel, when she was speaking with them, that they were the only person in the room. She also slept badly much of the time. The palace was never fully quiet. Stone corridors carry sound in strange ways, and the building was never without its servants, its guards, its nighttime traffic of messages and errands. She wrote sometimes at night, at the small writing table in her inner room. Letters to her mother and later to her children, in that careful, slightly laboured handwriting that had never fully overcome the gaps in her early education.
The apartments are open to the public today, restored to something close to their appearance in her time. Tourists walk through them in long, shuffling lines, and occasionally someone stops in the Queen's chamber and looks at the bed and tries to imagine what it must have felt like to sleep, or try to sleep, in a room like this, in a bed like this, in a palace like this. The answer, I think, is that you would have stopped noticing the gold eventually. You would have stopped seeing the frescoed ceiling. The grandeur would have become simply home. And home, whatever its external appearance, is just the place where your private self lives, worrying the ordinary worries, loving the ordinary loves, trying to find the rest that the day has spent. She worried, she loved, she tried to find rest. The rooms held all of it, and remembered none of it. Section 7. The Court of Fashion. Rose Bertine, wigs, and Madame Deficit. If there is one dimension of Marie Antoinette's life at Versailles that most people know something about, it is the fashion. The towering wigs, the elaborate gowns, the feathers and jewels and ribbons and panniers that spread the skirts of her dresses into extraordinary lateral widths that made passing through ordinary doorways technically challenging. The sheer visual spectacle of her public appearance at the height of her reign in the late 1770s and early 1780s, when she was the most photographed person in Europe, except that photography didn't exist yet, so instead she was the most painted, sketched, engraved, and gossiped about woman on the continent, and the particular image of her in that period, powdered and gilded and seemingly impervious to gravity, became the image that history preserved most strongly.
The story of Marie Antoinette and fashion begins properly with a woman named Rose Bertin. Bertin was a dressmaker, though that word undersells her profoundly. She was the most celebrated milliner and couturière in Paris, a woman of genuine creative talent and formidable business sense, who had built a reputation and a clientele that extended far beyond France. When the young queen summoned her to Versailles, it was the beginning of one of the most productive and expensive creative partnerships of the century. Bertin visited the palace regularly, sometimes multiple times a week, bringing fabrics and designs and the kind of focused creative attention that Marie Antoinette genuinely responded to. The Queen had real aesthetic sensibility, not just in fashion, but in interior design, music, theatre, and landscape. And Bertin was skilled enough to work with that sensibility, rather than against it, translating the Queen's instincts into wearable reality. The results were extraordinary, and also expensive. Very expensive. The Queen's clothing budget was already substantial by any standard, but under Bertin's influence, it became something else, a significant and regularly discussed item in the royal accounts, and eventually a focal point for public resentment.
The hairstyles were their own particular phenomenon. In the 1770s, Parisian fashion moved toward height with a kind of competitive fervour, and Marie Antoinette, as the most visible woman in France, became the unwilling standard-bearer for the genre's most extreme expressions. Her hair, or rather the constructions built over and around her hair by her hairdresser, Léonard Autier, using her own hair combined with horsehair padding and wire frames, could reach heights of 2 and 3 feet above her head. These creations were then decorated according to the occasion, or the season, or the particular whim of the day. Flowers, feathers, ribbons, jewels, tiny replica ships in full sail, small pastoral scenes complete with miniature figures and trees. There is an account from this period of Marie Antoinette having to kneel on the floor of her carriage because the structure atop her head would not fit through the door any other way. There are accounts of doors in the palace being specially widened to accommodate the skirts of fashionable gowns. There are accounts of women at court being unable to sit down for hours because the padding that gave their dresses their correct silhouette made sitting uncomfortable, and so they stood and drank standing and managed to make this look perfectly natural because they had been doing it long enough. All of this, the hairstyles, the dresses, the jewels, the sheer volume of it, cost money. A great deal of money. Marie Antoinette spent lavishly on clothing in the early years of her queenship, and the figure that historians have most often cited, though the exact numbers are debated, runs into the hundreds of thousands of livres annually. By the time France was struggling with a genuine financial crisis in the mid-1780s, which was not her fault, but which she became the symbol of regardless, the public nickname they had given her, Madame Deficit, had a very specific image attached to it. A woman with a 3-foot wig and a dress that could house a small family, spending money that should have been buying bread. The irony, documented carefully by historians, is that Marie Antoinette's own spending habits had changed significantly by the time she acquired that nickname. Once she became a mother, in the late 1770s and early 1780s,
She genuinely pulled back from the most extreme expressions of court fashion. She wore plainer clothes at the Petit Trianon. She stopped ordering new gowns at the pace she once had. She dismissed Leonard's most theatrical hair creations in favour of something simpler, lighter, more natural. Muslin dresses and relatively simple coiffures in the mode anglaise that she favoured in her private hours. She spent less on jewels. Her household, while still enormous by ordinary standards, was not growing.
But the image of Madame Deficit had already been fixed in the public imagination, and images, once fixed, do not easily release. Pamphlets circulated, the libelles, scurrilous broadsheets printed and distributed by her enemies, full of exaggerated and sometimes entirely invented stories of her extravagance and immorality. The woman described in those pamphlets bore only the faintest resemblance to the actual person living in the palace, but the woman in the pamphlets was the one that most of France came to believe in, and that belief was as solid as iron and as difficult to shift. Her actual relationship with fashion was more nuanced than either the pamphlets or the romantic mythology suggest. She used clothes the way she used her apartments, as a space of genuine personal expression in a world that offered very little else. The choices she made in fabric and silhouette and colour were choices she could make herself, in a life where almost nothing else was within her control. The creativity she brought to it was real. The joy she took in it was real. And the cost of it, not just in money, but in the narrative that built up around it, was also entirely real. She was neither the spendthrift monster of the libelles, nor the tragic victim of fashion's requirements. She was a woman who loved beautiful things, who had more money than most people will ever see, and who lived in a world that both expected and resented her for spending it. Section 8. The Petit Trianon, a world of her own. Walk far enough through the gardens of Versailles, past the formal geometries of the parterre and the long shimmer of the Grand Canal, past the groves and the fountains and the carefully managed wilderness of the bosquets, and eventually you reach a part of the estate that feels different, quieter, less emphatic, where the great palace behind you has been making a continuous argument about power and grandeur for the past hour. Here the argument stops. Here things are permitted to be small. The Petit Trianon sits among trees at the northern end of the estate. It is a building of such composed, restrained beauty that it almost seems to be apologizing for the excess that surrounds it. Built by the architect Anne-Jacques Gabriel for Louis XV between 1762 and 1768, it is a 3-story cube of cream limestone with a flat roof and a classical portico, perfectly proportioned, without ornament for its own sake, designed to be beautiful the way a well-written sentence is beautiful, through precision and whiteness rather than decoration. It was, when it was built, considered a masterpiece of neoclassical architecture, and it still is. Louis XV had built it for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour,
who died 4 years before it was completed and never lived in it. His next mistress, Madame du Barry, occupied it briefly. Then Louis died in 1774, and the new king, Louis XVI, gave it the building, the grounds, and the exclusive use of all of it to his 19-year-old queen as an accession gift.
She received the keys on May 24th, 1774, 2 weeks after becoming Queen of France. The gesture was loving in the simple, direct way that Louis was sometimes capable of. A shy man offering the best thing he had, which was the ability to give his wife something no one else could give her. She could do what she wanted with the Petite Trianon. It was, as far as anything could be at Versailles, hers. What she did with it took time and money and a great deal of creative energy, but the principle was clear from the beginning. The Petite Trianon would be the opposite of the main palace. If Versailles was public, the Trianon would be private. If Versailles was formal, the Trianon would be relaxed. If Versailles required performance at every waking moment, the Trianon would permit, or at least approximate, something like rest. She redesigned the interior herself. Gone were the heavy fabrics and oppressive gilding of the staterooms. In came lighter colours, soft blues, greens, whites, with floral motifs repeated in the painted panels and the upholstered furniture and the delicate porcelain objects she chose for the shelves. The rooms were small by Versailles standards. They were furnished for comfort and conversation, not ceremony. There were bookshelves stocked with things she actually read, a music room with instruments she actually played, a theatre, small, charming, complete with painted sets, where she and her close circle performed amateur theatrical productions that she both directed and appeared in, to the scandalised delight of those who disapproved and the delighted scandalisation of those who approved. She redesigned the gardens too, and this is perhaps the most revealing of all her choices. The gardens that existed around the Petite Trianon when she received it were formal ones, part of the same classical geometry that governed the whole of the Versailles estate. She had them replaced with an English garden. She had winding paths laid through meadows and groves. A flowing stream was redirected to create curves rather than straight lines. A small grotto was built beneath a constructed hill of rocks. A belvedere, a little open-sided pavilion, was placed at the top of an artificial mound to offer a view across the soft, irregular landscape she had created. The English garden style was fashionable across Europe in the 1770s and 1780s, partly in reaction to the hyper-rational formality of the French classical tradition, partly because of a broader cultural movement toward nature, authenticity, and the pastoral, the same movement that produced Rousseau's writings on natural virtue and the nobility of simple rural life. Marie Antoinette's garden was thoroughly of its time, but it was also something more personal than fashion. It was a physical expression of what she actually wanted, a world that moved in curves, that surprised you around corners, that allowed for something to be slightly unexpected, slightly wild, not entirely under control. The Petite Trianon, was where she chose her own company. In the main palace, the Queen's circle was determined by rank, protocol, and the centuries-old machinery of the court. She couldn't simply decide she liked someone and spend time with them. Or rather, she could, but doing so was itself a political act that would be observed, analysed, discussed, and turned into gossip within hours. At the Trianon, she was the absolute ruler of who came and who did not. She gave the only invitations, and the invitations went to the people she genuinely liked, rather than the people protocol required her to entertain. Her favourites varied over the years. There was the Princess de Lamballe, gentle and devoted, who remained loyal to her through everything. There was the Duchesse de Polignac, vivacious and charming, and somewhat more interested in the Queen's patronage than the Queen herself fully acknowledged. There was the Swedish diplomat, Count Axel von Fersen, whose friendship with the Queen has been the subject of romantic speculation ever since, and who was genuinely close to her in the final difficult years. At the Petite Trianon, these people could sit with her without ceremony, could walk in the gardens without an entourage, could play music and perform theatrical farces, and spend evenings that were, by Versailles standards, almost ordinary. Almost. Because even at the Trianon, she was the Queen. The informal atmosphere was still carefully maintained by servants. The guests still observed certain gradations of behaviour around her. And outside the walls of the Trianon estate, in the main palace and the town and the wider world beyond, the story that people were telling about what went on in her private retreat grew more and more detached from the reality. The libelles described the Trianon as a place of orgies and extravagance, of endless parties and money thrown into decorations that would astonish the world. None of this was true. The parties were modest by court standards. The renovations were expensive, but not ruinous. The Queen's behaviour there was, by all credible accounts, quite ordinary. She walked, she played music, she staged theatricals, she spent time with friends she genuinely liked. But the image that the libelles created, the spendthrift Queen at her private pleasure palace, oblivious to France's suffering, was far more compelling than the truth, and far more useful to those who had reasons to want the public angry. The Trianon was her best attempt to find something real inside the artifice. Whether it succeeded is another question. Section 9. The Hameau de la Reine. Playing at simplicity. Deeper still into the grounds, beyond the Petit Trianon and its English garden, past the Temple of Love with its circular colonnade of white marble that caught the light on summer afternoons and held it like a cup holds water, there was something even stranger. A village. Or something that looked like a village, from the right angle, in the right light. Thatched cottages clustered around a small, irregular lake. A watermill with a turning wheel. A dovecot. A barn. A farmhouse with chickens in the yard and cows in the adjoining meadow. Winding paths between the buildings, kitchen gardens growing vegetables and herbs, a dairy cleanly whitewashed, the soft sound of water and the soft sound of animals.
This was the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet, and it was built between 1783 and 1786 to the design of the architect Richard Meek, with the landscape painter Hubert Robert assisting in the composition of the views and the arrangement of the buildings, to ensure that from every approach the hamlet looked exactly like a painting of a hamlet, picturesque in precisely the right way. Because that, of course, is what it was. Not a real village, not genuine poverty, not an authentic expression of peasant life. It was a beautifully crafted theatrical set built around the concept of simplicity, by and for a woman who had never in her life been genuinely simple, and who longed for simplicity the way people who have never experienced deprivation sometimes do, as an aesthetic, as a relief, as an imagined alternative to everything their actual lives contained. This has been used against her repeatedly, both in her own time and in the centuries since, and it deserves a little more careful examination than the easy contempt it usually receives. The pastoral retreat was not Marie Antoinette's invention. The entire aristocracy of Europe in the late 18th century was infatuated with the idea of rustic simplicity, playing at farming, building cottages in their grounds, dressing in muslin and reading Rousseau, and performing the conventions of natural virtue while living at the top of the most elaborate social hierarchy in history. Marie Antoinette was doing what everyone in her class was doing. She was simply doing it in a more expensive and more carefully designed version than most. And the Hameau, whatever it says about the cultural contradictions of the Ancien regime, was a genuinely lovely place. The buildings were designed in a Norman Flemish vernacular style, with steeply pitched thatched roofs, half timbering, and the kind of irregularity that gives old buildings their charm. Not identical houses in a row, but distinct structures with individual characters, placed in relation to each other and to the lake and the mill stream, as though they had simply grown there over generations. The landscape around them was carefully managed to look unmanaged. The meadow grass was allowed to grow long in certain places. Wildflowers were planted to colonize the banks of the stream. The trees around the lake were arranged to create reflections and partial views rather than clear sightlines. Inside, the Queen's house, the Maison de la Reine, which was the largest and most important building, was a different story. The exterior was as rustic as the rest of the hamlet. The interior was fully, unapologetically luxurious. The rooms were small, but furnished with extraordinary quality. Silk upholstery, fine porcelain, gilded fire dogs in the form of goats eating grapes. That particular detail always strikes me as capturing something perfectly. The joke that the Hameau's designers were entirely in on, the exquisite luxury hiding behind the rustic facade. Real farm animals were kept in the hamlet. Real milk was produced in the dairy, and the Queen sometimes came to watch the milking, or to tend the garden, or to feed the chickens. Whether she did this as a genuine attempt at physical engagement with something simple and unmediated, or whether the theatrical dimension was always uppermost in her mind,
is impossible to know. Probably both were true simultaneously, in the way that things often are when the human desire for authenticity collides with the impossibility of fully leaving one's context behind.
What is clear is that she loved the place. She came to the hamlet often, sometimes with friends and sometimes nearly alone, and spent hours there that her letters and the accounts of her ladies describe as genuinely tranquil. She walked slowly. She sat by the lake. She watched the ducks. She breathed air that smelled of grass and water rather than candle wax and perfume. She was still the queen, but here, more than anywhere else in the Versailles estate, she could manage something approaching the feeling of being merely a person. It was, in the end, an illusion. Not a deliberate deception, but an illusion nonetheless. The farm workers who kept the hamlet operating were real employees, paid wages, living lives of genuine rural complexity that had nothing to do with the picturesque. The cattle had a keeper, the kitchen garden had a gardener, the mill was maintained by a miller. The queen played at simplicity, while other people actually lived it, which is a distinction that her contemporaries among the poor of France were not likely to miss. But the longing that the hamlet represented was genuine. The hunger for a quieter, less observed, less theatrical existence, that was real. She built the most beautiful escape she could imagine from the life she was trapped in, and she spent as much time there as the demands of Versailles would allow. She was there, alone in the garden, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1789, when a page came running across the grass with news from Paris. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Section 10. Marriage, friendship, and the quiet hours. Let your breathing settle a little more. Let the story slow down for a few minutes, because this part of it moves at a gentler pace. This is the interior life, not the spectacle, not the ceremony, but the private texture of days. The marriage between Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI is one of the most peculiar royal partnerships in European history, and also, in its own reserved way, one of the more moving ones. They were not well matched by temperament. This was understood from the beginning by everyone who knew them, and it created a particular kind of social awkwardness in those early years, when the pressure on the Dauphine to produce an heir was relentless, and the reason she wasn't producing one was the subject of the most intimate and embarrassing speculation at every court in Europe. The marriage was not consummated for 7 years, from 1770, when they were married, until 1777, when it finally occurred, and the reason was a medical one on Louis's part, a condition that required a minor surgical procedure he was extremely reluctant to have, and eventually, under considerable pressure from his brother-in-law, the Emperor Joseph II, did have. During those 7 years, Marie Antoinette was in a genuinely difficult position. She was the Dauphine and then the Queen, but without the children that gave a queen her political importance and her personal purpose. The French court watched and waited and whispered. Her mother wrote letters from Vienna that were simultaneously supportive and blaming, urging her daughter to try harder, to be more appealing, to find a way to encourage the king toward consummation with a persistence that must have felt alternately touching and completely insufferable. The public was curious and eventually impatient. The libelles were already inventing stories, not about her extravagance yet, but about her sexuality, her supposed infidelities, her imagined lovers. The French public's imagination about what their queen was doing when she wasn't producing an heir was apparently limitless. Through all of this, the actual relationship between Marie Antoinette and Louis was warmer than the political circumstances suggest. He was devoted to her in a genuine, uncomplicated way that he was not always able to express, but that was evident in his actions. He gave her the Petit Trianon. He approved her renovation projects and her theatrical indulgences and her choice of friends, without demanding the political input that a more controlling husband might have insisted on. He was present for her in his quiet, awkward way, and she was fond of him, not passionately, not perhaps in the way the romantics who have written about her would prefer, but with the real warmth of long familiarity and genuine respect.
His evenings were different from hers. He went to bed earlier, slept heavily, woke at first light, already thinking about whatever mechanical or administrative problem was occupying him that week. He had the mind of an engineer applied to the problems of governance, which was both a genuine asset and a genuine limitation. He was good at details. He was good at the patient accumulation of information before a decision. He was less good at the rapid, instinctive responses that a revolution requires, less good at reading the room, less good at the theatrical dimension of kingship that his great-great-grandfather Louis XIV had mastered, and that his position urgently demanded. He was also, in his private way, a good man. This is not always acknowledged in accounts of the royal couple that focus on the political failures of his reign. He did not drink to excess. He did not take mistresses, which was so unusual for a French king that it was itself remarked upon with some puzzlement by the court, which was accustomed to official royal favourites as a permanent feature of the political landscape. He was faithful to his wife in the absolute sense, devoted to his children, honest in his dealings, and genuinely troubled by the suffering of his people in ways that occasionally produced real action. He abolished torture during judicial proceedings, for instance, and he supported the abolition of serfdom in France, and he was intellectually engaged by the Enlightenment currents that were reshaping European thought during his reign.
He simply wasn't capable of handling what happened to France during his years on the throne, and no one, not the most brilliant, most charismatic, most politically gifted monarch in European history, might have been capable of it either. France was changing in ways that went beyond any individual king's ability to manage. The tragedy of Louis XVI is that he was a decent man in a role that required something different from decency. It required ruthlessness, or genius, or extraordinary luck,
and he had none of the three. In the evenings, when circumstances allowed, he and Marie Antoinette spent time together in ways that were genuinely companionable. They ate together. They walked together in the garden on summer evenings. He attended her theatrical performances at the Trianon, sitting in the front row of the small theatre and applauding with the slightly effortful enthusiasm of a man who doesn't entirely follow theatrical comedy, but loves the person performing it. She attended his locksmithing demonstrations with a patient good humour that said everything about the kind of partnership they had developed over the years. It was not the great passion of romantic legend. It was something quieter, and perhaps in its way more durable. The mutual respect of two people who had been placed together without their consent, and had found over time that they genuinely liked each other, that they were better together than apart, that the particular loneliness of their position, the loneliness of being always watched, always performing, never simply private, was slightly less lonely when shared.
Her friendships, apart from her relationship with Louis, were the emotional centre of her life. She was someone who needed people around her, not the formal audience of courtiers, but genuine personal connection, the kind that involves real conversation and shared jokes and the comfort of being known. At the Petite Trianon, she built that around her. The Princess de Lamballe became her closest companion in the early years, a gentle, devoted woman who followed the Queen almost everywhere, and who would, in the terrible years of the Revolution, refuse to abandon her and pay for that loyalty with her life. The Duchesse de Polignac was a different kind of friend, more vivacious, more socially adept, genuinely charming in the way that makes you want to be near someone, even when you suspect they are not entirely trustworthy. The Queen loved her for years, and the friendship cost her, not in betrayal, but in reputation, because the Polignacs took advantage of royal favour with an enthusiasm that the public noticed and resented. Her evenings in the private apartments and at the Trianon had a rhythm to them that she seems to have genuinely valued. Music was central. She played the harpsichord with real ability and sang with a voice that her music teacher praised warmly and her contemporaries remembered with affection. She and her circle would sometimes spend evenings simply playing together. Informal concerts in the small music room at the Trianon, the doors open to the summer garden, the sound drifting out into the dark.
She was also, in those hours, funny. This is something that gets lost in the accounts of her that focus on the grandeur and the tragedy. The letters she wrote to her friends are full of dry observations, gentle mockery, the kind of humour that comes from watching a ridiculous world closely for a long time and finding the comedy in it. She had a sharp eye and a quick tongue when she was among people she trusted. She imitated courtiers' mannerisms. She nicknamed people. She laughed. These are the hours that don't get into the history books. The evenings when nothing happened except the fire burning and a card game going too long and someone making everyone laugh and the night outside growing later. But these are also the hours that made the rest bearable. Section 11. Motherhood, Children, Loss, and a Softer Queen.
She became a mother on December 19th, 1778, when she was 23 years old, and the child, a girl, Marie Therese Charlotte, called Madame Royale, was born in that crowded, suffocating chamber that the court had filled to witness the event. The birth changed her. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in ways that people who watched her closely noticed over the months and years that followed. She had always had warmth. It was one of her most remarked upon qualities, but there was a quality to her warmth before motherhood that was slightly diffuse, slightly scattered. The warmth of a person who liked everyone and was intensely present with whoever was in front of her. After Madame Royale's birth, something concentrated. She became more focused, more purposeful, more serious in a way that the casual observer might not immediately notice, but that the people closest to her did.
She was a devoted mother. This is well documented, not in the self-congratulatory way of public performance, but in the quieter evidence of how she spent her time. She was physically present with her children in a way that was not expected of queens and was not, strictly speaking, required. She breastfed Madame Royale herself for a period, a choice so unusual for a woman of her class and position that it was itself a small act of defiance against convention. She supervised her children's education, wrote instructions for their nurseries, chose their toys, walked with them in the gardens, sat with them when they were ill. Her second child, born in October 1781, was a son, Louis Joseph, the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, and his birth was greeted with the kind of national celebration that only the birth of a male heir to a throne can generate. Cannons fired, church bells rang across France, the streets of Paris filled with crowds that were genuinely, simply joyful about the future that this small new life represented. Marie Antoinette received the news of the public celebrations from her bed at Versailles, still recovering, and reportedly wept from a complex emotion that contained happiness and relief and something more private and exhausted. Her third child was a daughter, Sophie Helene Beatrice, born in July 1786. Sophie died less than a year later, in June 1787, and the grief of it, the particular grief of losing a very young child, which is one of the heaviest that human beings carry, marked the Queen visibly. She grew thinner in the months afterward. She was quieter. She spent more time alone in the gardens.
Her fourth child, Louis Charles, was born in March 1785, and he was the child who would become the subject of the most heartbreaking chapter of her story. But that chapter belongs to a later section. What motherhood did to her public life was clarifying in a specific way. It gave her enemies less material to work with, and also gave her less appetite for the battles. She genuinely pulled back from the more extravagant public expressions of court fashion after her children were born. She ordered fewer new gowns. She spent less at the gaming tables. She was less visible at the late-night balls and theatrical performances that had been her social staples in the 1770s. She preferred the evenings at the Trianon, or better still, at the Hameau, with her children and a small circle of people she actually liked.
The public did not entirely notice this change, or rather the libels that shaped the public perception didn't allow for it to be noticed. The image of Madame Deficit, the spendthrift Austrian queen, had been fixed in people's imaginations, and the actual, quieter woman who was spending her evenings reading to her children and worrying about the health of her eldest son was not the character that made for interesting pamphlets.
Louis Joseph, the Dauphin, was a delicate child who grew progressively more fragile as he aged. By the late 1780s, it was clear that he was seriously ill. Tuberculosis of the spine was the diagnosis, in a century before anyone had a name for it, and the trajectory was agonizing in its slowness. She spent hours at his bedside. She was with him when he died in June 1789, 7 years old, while France outside the palace walls was already in the early convulsions of its revolution, and the world her children had been born into was shaking apart around them. She lost him and then turned back to face what was coming. There is something in that, in the simultaneity of private grief and public catastrophe, in the requirement to keep going when everything you love is under threat, that belongs not only to her story, but to the broader human experience of living through terrible times. She was a mother who buried a child while a revolution gathered at her gates. She held that and kept moving, because there was nothing else to do. Section 12. The Diamond Necklace Affair. A reputation shattered. Of all the things that brought Marie Antoinette down, the one that did the most damage was something she had nothing to do with.
The necklace was built to be extraordinary. The Parisian jewellers Baume and Bassenge had begun assembling it in the early 1770s at the request of Louis XV, who wanted to give it as a gift to his mistress, Madame du Barry. They spent years tracking down the right stones, purchasing them from sources across Europe, assembling them into a single piece of jewellery of unprecedented scale and splendour. The finished necklace contained 647 diamonds. Some of the individual stones ran to several carats each. The total weight of the diamonds alone was approximately 2,800 carats. The piece was so heavy and elaborate that it required its own supporting structure. At the time of its completion, it was valued at approximately 1.6 million livres, a sum so astronomical that gathering the gemstones had nearly bankrupted its creators, and finding a buyer was proving correspondingly difficult. Louis XV died in 1774, before he could present it. Madame du Barry fell out of favour. The jewellers were left with the most expensive piece of jewellery in France and no obvious purchaser. They tried to sell it to the new king and queen. They approached Louis XVI in 1778 with the suggestion that he purchase it for Marie Antoinette. The queen herself apparently tried on the necklace and was interested, but ultimately the purchase was not completed. According to one account, possibly apocryphal but plausible, she said France needed battleships more than it needed necklaces. The real reason is not recorded.
but the result is clear. She declined it. The jewellers continued to shop the piece around the European courts without success. And then, in 1785, a woman named Jeanne de Valois Saint Remy entered the story, and everything that followed was her doing.
Jeanne was a clever, desperate, entirely unscrupulous woman who had a legitimate but impoverished claim to descent from the Valois royal line, and had spent years trying to convert that claim into actual wealth and position at court. She had an intimate knowledge of court gossip and court ambitions, and she identified a target. Cardinal Louis de Rohan, the Archbishop of Strasbourg, a vain and ambitious man who had once offended Maria Theresa, and in consequence was deeply out of favour with the current queen. Rohan desperately wanted to restore himself to royal favour, and Jeanne de la Motte, as she styled herself, presented herself as someone who could help. She claimed a friendship with the Queen that did not exist. She forged letters from Marie Antoinette to Rohan, expressing growing warmth and gratitude. She arranged a secret nocturnal meeting in the gardens of Versailles, in the grove called the Bosque de Venus, between Rohan and a young woman who, in the darkness, was dressed and made up to resemble the Queen, and who played the role convincingly enough to persuade the Cardinal that he had just enjoyed a private moonlit audience with Marie Antoinette. He had been speaking to a prostitute named Nicole Legay de Liva, who had been hired specifically for the performance. Emboldened by what he believed was royal favour, and further deceived by forged letters carrying the Queen's supposed signature, Rohan agreed to act as a secret intermediary in the purchase of the necklace. He negotiated with the jewellers on behalf of, he believed, the Queen. He delivered the necklace to a man he was told was the Queen's valet. The necklace vanished into Jeanne's hands, was broken up, and the diamonds sold and scattered across Europe. When the jewellers came to court for their first payment, the deception unravelled. The Queen had never ordered the necklace. The letters bore her forged signature, signed Marie Antoinette de France, when French royals signed only with their given names. Louis XVI, furious, had Rohan arrested in the Hall of Mirrors on August 15, 1785, in front of the entire assembled court, a decision that turned out to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The trial of Cardinal de Rohan was a public sensation. Paris followed it with intense attention, and when the verdict came, Rohan acquitted, his honour declared intact, the opera house where the decision was announced erupted in applause, and the crowd turned to jeer at the Queen. It was the first time in living memory that a verdict of a French court had been read as a direct rebuke to the crown. Marie Antoinette wept when she heard. She had been entirely innocent of any wrongdoing in the affair. She had not wanted the necklace, had not ordered it, had not signed the letters, had not met with Rohan in the garden. The fraud was Jeanne's, from beginning to end. But what the verdict communicated to the French public was not innocence. What it communicated
was that when the court weighed the reputation of a cardinal against the word of a queen, the cardinal's reputation won.
Napoleon, years later, would remark that the Queen's death must be dated from the diamond necklace trial. Historians have debated this formulation ever since, but the core of it rings true. The affair crystallized a public narrative about Marie Antoinette that could not be undone by evidence, because the narrative was not really about the necklace. It was about everything the necklace had come to represent. The obscene wealth of the court, the arrogance of the monarchy, the gap between the gilded world of Versailles and the daily reality of ordinary French life. The Queen was the easiest face to put on that gap, and the acquittal of Rohan made her the villain of a story in which she was actually the victim. She never quite recovered from it in the public imagination. The 4 years between the trial and the revolution saw her reputation erode with a steady inexorability that no amount of genuine good behaviour could arrest. She pulled back from public life. She spent more time with her children. She was quieter, more withdrawn, more careful. None of it mattered. The story was already written. Section 13. The Gardens of Versailles. Walking through green silence. Let us slow down again. Let us leave the politics and the scandal for a moment and simply walk. The Gardens of Versailles are extraordinary at any hour, in any season, in any weather. But they are most themselves in the long summer evenings, when the light comes in low from the west and turns everything it touches to gold. The gravel, the water, the stone faces of the statues, the pale limestone of the palace facade behind you as you walk away from it toward the horizon. André Le Nôtre designed these gardens in the 1660s and 1670s for Louis XIV, and the design is so coherent, so assured, and so thoroughly thought through that standing inside it today, more than 3.5 centuries later, it feels less like a historic garden and more like a proposition about how to organize the world. Everything proceeds from a central axis, the line that runs from the middle of the palace's western facade through the central parterre, down to the edge of the Grand Canal, and beyond it to the far tree line that marks the horizon. Along this axis, and branching from it in a system of perpendicular and diagonal paths, the entire garden unfolds in its geometric regularity, its perfectly clipped hedges and precisely raked gravel, and fountains placed at mathematically appropriate intervals. And yet it is not rigid. This is what surprises people who have only seen the gardens in photographs. It is not cold. The scale of it, you can walk for an hour and still be within the formal garden, gives it a quality that small formal gardens lack, a kind of breathing space, a sense of immensity that paradoxically relaxes rather than oppresses. The geometry is clear enough to be calming, but the distances are large enough that you can almost always find a stretch of path where you are alone, or nearly so. Marie Antoinette walked in these gardens every day when the weather allowed. It was one of the few forms of exercise that protocol permitted the Queen in any reasonable measure, and she seems to have valued it genuinely. The morning promenade, a formal walk through the parterre, was part of the official daily schedule, but she also walked informally in the late afternoon, when the official day had run its course and the evening had not yet begun, in the brief window when the gardens were not yet deserted, but no longer busy. She knew the gardens in the intimate way that you only know a place you have walked through thousands of times. She knew which bosquet, which enclosed grove hidden within the hedgerows, was coolest in the afternoon heat. She knew where the fountain basin called the Bassin de Neptune caught the evening light most beautifully, turning the jets of water into threads of gold. She knew the orange trees in their silver tubs, 3,000 of them, brought inside the vast orangerie each winter and brought out again each spring, in a seasonal migration that was one of the most impressive regular spectacles of the palace's year. She knew which paths the deer used at dawn, moving from the royal hunting forest at the estate's outer edge, across the more formal sections of the garden, before the gardeners arrived to reclaim the gravel. She knew the particular smell of box hedge warmed by the afternoon sun, slightly sharp, slightly medicinal, the smell of every formal garden in France, and somehow also distinctly and specifically this one. She knew the sound the fountains made at full pressure on the days when the waterworks engineers opened all the valves, and the different, smaller sound they made on ordinary days, when only some of the jets were running, and the pressure dropped, and the water fell in softer, less ambitious arcs. The parterre de broderie, directly below the palace windows, was one of the places she walked most frequently, because it was the part of the garden most immediately accessible from the Queen's apartments, and also because it offered the most unobstructed view of the sky. The broderie patterns, the intricate scroll-work of clipped box hedging laid out against backgrounds of coloured sand and gravel, were best appreciated from above, from the windows of the palace. At ground level, walking between them, the patterns dissolved into a different experience altogether. Low green walls at knee-height, the faint medicinal fragrance, the sound of your own footsteps on pale gravel, the sky above enormously open, and the palace behind you enormous, but at that angle somehow less oppressive. At that angle you were in the garden rather than being observed from it, and the distinction mattered. Further into the garden, past the great round basin of the Latona fountain, with its gilded figures of the goddess and her children being transformed by Jupiter into frogs and turtles, a peculiarly specific mythological story to render in 50 feet of gold and marble, but then Versailles never shied from peculiarity in its mythological programmes. The path descended gently toward the Allée Royale, and beyond it the Apollo fountain, and beyond that
the long glimmer of the Grand Canal stretching to the western horizon. The Grand Canal was its own world within the world of the gardens. 1,670 metres long and 120 metres wide, it lay at the foot of the central axis like a flat blue road to the sky. In fine weather it reflected the clouds perfectly, and at certain hours of the afternoon it was impossible to tell where the water ended and the sky began. Venice gondolas had once been kept here, along with a small fleet of decorated pleasure boats, and Louis XVI maintained a naval academy at the western end of the canal. The Queen sometimes went out on the water in the evenings, quiet boating parties, accompanied by musicians on a separate boat, the sound of strings and woodwind drifting across the surface of the water in the warm air.
These are the hours that the history of Marie Antoinette tends to pass over quickly. The revolution is coming, and history, knowing what it knows, keeps pulling forward, keeps alerting us to the gathering storm. But she didn't know the storm was gathering. Not in those golden evenings on the water, not in those walks through the bosquets with the fountain sound in the background. She knew something was wrong, eventually. No one as intelligent as she was could have missed the signals. But the evenings were still evenings. The light was still light. The water was still water. The gardens were also, in those years, increasingly a place she went alone, or nearly alone. As the 1780s progressed and her circle contracted, some friends returning to their own estates, some moving abroad as the political climate grew tense, some drifting away for reasons that had more to do with the shifting currents of court than with any specific rupture, the solitude of the gardens became less a luxury and more a default. She walked with a few ladies or with her children, and she walked without pretending to be anything other than tired. And the garden, which had no opinion about queens, received her without judgment. There is a quality to places that have been walked by the same person many thousands of times, a kind of soft impression that is more psychological than physical, a sense that the space has been shaped, however subtly, by habitual presence. I think the gardens of Versailles carry this, in the areas she walked most often. In the grove of the colonnade, with its 32 arches of coloured marble, and the central basin, where the sound of water is softly echoed and multiplied by the stone. In the Allée Royale, the wide central path between the Latona fountain and the Apollo fountain, where the perspective draws the eye forward and forward until the vanishing point becomes a kind of question. In the small paths at the edge of the formal garden, where the clipped hedges give way to taller trees, and the sound of the fountains fades, and something older and quieter takes its place. She walked here, she breathed here, she let the day's performance drain away into the gravel and the water and the blue air. It was enough. While it lasted, it was enough. Section 14. Revolution at the gates. The world outside the walls.
France. The France that existed beyond the gates of Versailles, and had been existing there all along, was a different country entirely from the one inside. It is worth pausing to understand this, because the relationship between the world inside Versailles and the world outside it is the essential context for everything that followed, and it is easy, when you are walking through those gilded rooms and those immaculate gardens, to forget that somewhere beyond the horizon people were hungry.
France in the 1780s was in serious financial trouble. The roots of the crisis were deep and structural. A tax system that was radically unjust, exempting the nobility and clergy from most taxation, while placing the heaviest burden on the peasantry and the emerging middle classes. A national debt that had been building for decades through a series of expensive wars. Most recently, France's participation in the American Revolutionary War, which had cost the country enormous sums, while simultaneously spreading dangerous ideas about liberty and representation. And a series of harvest failures in the mid to late 1780s that produced bread shortages severe enough to tip an already struggling population toward genuine desperation. None of this was caused by Marie Antoinette. Her personal spending, though real and sometimes significant, was a rounding error in the context of the national debt. France was not going broke because the Queen bought too many dresses. France was going broke because of structural economic failures, decades of mismanaged royal finances, and the fundamental injustice of a system in which the people with the least money paid the most taxes.
But she was the symbol, not in the abstract political way that symbols usually work, but in the visceral, immediate way that a face becomes the face of something larger than itself. The libelles had done their work. The diamond necklace affair had done its work. The nickname Madame Deficit had done its work. When ordinary Parisians thought about what was wrong with France, many of them thought about a fair-haired Austrian woman in an enormous dress, buying things she didn't need, with money that should have been feeding them. This was an injustice, in the precise sense of the word, an unfair distribution of blame. But it was also, in the context of a society stretched to breaking, completely understandable. The bread riots began in earnest in the spring and summer of 1789. Women who had nothing to feed their children were not interested in the nuances of national finance. They were interested in bread, and they were not getting it. The price of a £4 loaf of bread had risen to the point where an average working-class family might spend 80 or 90% of its daily income on bread alone, leaving essentially nothing for anything else. Children were going to sleep hungry. People were dying. And at Versailles, the palace still blazed with light in the evenings, and the court still ate its elaborate meals in its elaborate rooms.
On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate, the representatives of the commoners at the Estates General, the great consultative assembly that Louis XVI had reluctantly convened to address the financial crisis,
declared itself a national assembly and swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disperse until they had given France a constitution. This was, in retrospect, the beginning of the revolution in any formal sense. On July 14, 1789, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, the medieval fortress that served as a royal prison and a symbol of royal power. The garrison was small, the fortress fell, the governor was killed, his head put on a pike, and the image of that, the head of a royal official displayed on a pole in the streets of Paris, was a signal that something had changed which could not be unchanged. Marie Antoinette heard about it at Versailles. She had been at Versailles through all of it, through the convening of the Estates General in May, which she had attended in ceremonial dress, trying to project the calm dignity that the situation required. Through the early weeks of June, when the news from Paris grew more alarming day by day. Through the death of her eldest son in June, which she had managed to bear in public with the composure her position required, and in private with the grief it deserved.
And she had written to her friends and to her mother's successors in Vienna, and to her brother, the emperor, with a gradually increasing frankness about how frightened she was. Not for herself specifically, but for the institution she represented, for the children she was protecting, for the world that was shaking apart around her in ways she could see but could not stop. The summer of 1789 was hot. The fountains played, the gardens maintained their perfect geometry. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in the lanes and markets and taverns of Paris, and in the fields of the French countryside where the harvest had failed again, the world was preparing to arrive. Section 15. The October Days. The last night at Versailles. She was in the grotto. It was October 5, 1789, and the afternoon was warm for the season, and she had gone alone, or nearly alone, with only one or two ladies in attendance, to the garden of the Petit Trianon, where the small constructed grotto, with its artificial rock and its trickle of water over stone, offered a kind of contained privacy that she had always valued. Most of her close friends had left France by now, returned to their families, or fled abroad in the weeks after July's violence. The court at Versailles was smaller than it had been, quieter, more watchful. She spent more time at the Trianon than ever, because the Trianon was the only place that still felt like hers. She was sitting in the grotto, alone with whatever thoughts occupied her in those difficult October days, when a page appeared at the garden gate.
He came running. That was the first sign. Pages did not run through the gardens of Versailles. There were centuries of protocol around how you moved in the presence of the Queen, and running was not part of it. When he ran, she knew the news was not ordinary. It was not ordinary. In Paris, since early that morning, a crowd had been gathering. It had started at the central market. Women mostly, wives and mothers who had been queuing since before dawn for bread that was not available, or was available only at prices that were impossible. The anger had been building for weeks.
weeks, and it needed somewhere to go. Someone said Versailles. Someone said the king must hear us. Someone said, we will go to Versailles and we will not leave without bread and without the king's promise. By the time the page reached the garden, the crowd was already miles along the road from Paris to Versailles. Thousands of people. Estimates ranged from 6 to 10,000. Mostly women, but also, as the march proceeded, members of the National Guard, journalists, activists, and men of various political intentions. They were armed, some of them, with pikes and muskets taken from the Paris armory. They were soaked. It had begun to rain, and they were furious, and they were 12 miles from the palace. Marie Antoinette read the page's message and rose from the grotto.
She walked quickly back through the garden, past the English lawns and the winding stream and the Temple of Love and the Belvedere, away from the Trianon, back along the path toward the main palace. The staff at the Petit Trianon began closing it up behind her, the shutters, the doors, and it was done quickly and with the particular efficiency of people who understood that this was not a normal departure. She would never come back. The afternoon and evening at the palace were tense, in the way that the hours before a storm are tense. Not with the relief of things breaking open yet, but with that particular pressure, that gathering weight in the air. Emissaries went back and forth. The king, who had been out hunting when the first news arrived, returned and went into deliberations with his ministers. The National Guard, theoretically on the side of order, was unreliable. The regular soldiers at the palace were loyal, but outnumbered by what was coming. The crowd arrived at Versailles in the late afternoon. They filled the courtyard. They shouted. Some of them pushed into the palace itself, into the rooms and corridors beyond the main gate, and for a few hours the situation was one of extreme and unpredictable danger. The king appeared on the balcony. He made promises about bread, about the Constitution, about coming to Paris. The crowd was partially quieted. That night most of the palace was sleepless. Marie Antoinette went to bed late and lay awake listening. Her ladies slept in shifts around her. The corridors outside were watched.
At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning of October the 6th, the crowd forced its way into the palace again, this time finding a back entrance that had not been properly secured. They moved through the corridors toward the Queen's apartments. The guards at her door were overpowered. 2 of them were killed in the corridor outside her rooms. She fled through the door that connected her bedchamber to the king's apartments, a door hidden in the wall panelling that she knew because she had used it countless times for informal visits, and which she now used for survival. She ran through the connecting passage in her nightgown. She knocked on the king's door. She was admitted. They embraced. They waited. Later that morning, they stood together on the great balcony of the palace, overlooking the courtyard, where the crowd below was enormous and densely packed, and still, at that moment, uncertain. The king and queen appeared.
There was shouting. Then someone called for the Queen alone. She stepped forward to the edge of the balcony. Her children began to follow, and she sent them back and stood alone. She stood there for a long moment, looking out over the crowd, the thousands of faces, the pikes and the flags and the grey October sky. And then she made a deep, slow curtsy. She bent all the way to the ground and held it and rose. The crowd went quiet. Then parts of it began to shout, "Long live the Queen."
It was the last time she would stand on that balcony. Later that day, the royal family climbed into their carriages under the pressure of the crowd's demand, and began the slow journey to Paris, escorted by thousands of people, surrounded all the way. The journey took 6 hours to cover 12 miles. The carriages moved through the pressing crowd at walking pace, and some of the people alongside the carriages carried pikes, and on the pikes were heads. Marie Antoinette sat in the carriage. She held her children. She did not look at the windows. Versailles emptied behind them. The servants remained, maintaining the palace in the way that servants maintain things, cleaning, keeping, preserving. But the royal family was gone, and without the royal family, Versailles was simply a building, an extraordinary building, a building full of rooms, but rooms without the people who had given them their meaning, their particular weight of daily life lived and felt and written and worried. The footsteps that had paced those corridors for 20 years were gone. The gardens would still be tended. The fountains would still be turned on for the great water displays on Sundays. But the woman who had walked those gravel paths thousands of times, who had sat in the grotto and played music at the Trianon, and watched her children chase each other through the Hameau's meadows, she was in a carriage in the rain, going somewhere she had never intended to be. She left Versailles forever on October 6, 1789. She was 33 years old. Section 16. What the Palace Remembers. Legacy and Silence.
The years between October 1789 and October 1793 are not part of the Versailles story, but they belong to hers, and so we will follow them briefly before we rest. The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, which was comfortable enough in the practical sense, but felt from the first day like what it was, a gilded cage. The Queen was watched, gossiped about, written about in pamphlets that grew more vicious by the month. The revolution proceeded through its stages: the constitutional monarchy, the flight to Varennes in June 1791, when the royal family attempted to escape France and were caught, recognized, and brought back under humiliating circumstances that ended the last vestiges of popular sympathy for the crown. The September massacres of 1792, the formal abolition of the monarchy, the imprisonment of the royal family in the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris that had been converted into a prison. In the Temple, she became someone the Versailles years had been preparing her to be, without her knowing it. All those years of performing in public while managing private grief,
all those levee ceremonies endured without complaint, all the unkind pamphlets absorbed without losing her composure in the ways that could be used against her, had given her a quality of self-containment that served her now in the most terrible way. She was quiet in the temple. She was patient. She taught her children. She sewed. She read. She prayed.
In August 1792, her husband was imprisoned separately. They saw each other occasionally, under supervision, with the painful formality of people who are together less frequently than they need to be. In January 1793, she was brought the news that Louis XVI had been executed. She went to her room, and what happened in that room is not recorded. In August 1793, she was separated from her son, Louis Charles, who was taken from her care and given over to a guardian whose job was to make him useful to the revolutionary government. She screamed when they took him. She held on to him. They were separated by force. She never saw him again. She was transferred to the conciergerie prison. She was tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal on October 14 and 15, 1793, on charges of treason, conspiracy against the Republic, and other accusations that were both politically motivated and largely fabricated, including a particularly vile accusation about her son that she refused to answer until pressed, and then answered with a dignity so complete that the gallery reportedly fell silent. She was convicted. She was sentenced to death. On October 16, 1793, she was taken by cart through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, the same place where fireworks had blazed on the evening of her first arrival in Paris as a 14-year-old girl, 23 years before. She was 37 years old. Her hair had gone white. She had been ill in prison and was thin, her eyes still, her face composed. The execution was carried out at 12 minutes past noon. She is buried in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where the kings and queens of France have rested for centuries, in a tomb placed beside Louis XVI. And Versailles? Versailles was partially plundered, partially preserved, changed into various things over the following decades. A revolutionary storehouse, a museum, a symbol and an embarrassment, and eventually a carefully maintained monument to the world that the revolution had destroyed. Napoleon visited and decided to keep it. Louis XVIII returned it to something of its former grandeur. Louis Philippe in the 1830s converted it entirely into a museum of French history. And in the early 20th century, serious work began on restoring the royal apartments to something approaching their pre-revolutionary appearance. Today, Versailles receives approximately 10 million visitors a year. They come from everywhere in the world. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors and photograph themselves. They walk through the gardens and stop at the Grand Canal. A significant number of them make the longer walk to the Petit Trianon and beyond it to the Hameau, where the thatched cottages still stand around their lake in the same arrangement that Meek designed in the 1780s. Some of those visitors stop at the entrance to the Queen's chamber in the state apartments and look at the bed, the reconstruction of the bed, since the original was dismantled
dispersed long ago, and try to imagine the woman who slept there. Many of them have seen films about her, many have read novels, many have a version of her already fixed in their imaginations from things they absorbed without noticing, the way you absorb things from a culture that has decided someone is worth remembering.
There have been many versions of her over the centuries. In the decades after her death, when the revolution had run its bloody course, and a restored monarchy looked back at what had happened, she became a martyr, a noble woman sacrificed on the altar of a mob's anger, a queen who died with dignity. In the 19th century, romantic writers and painters returned to her repeatedly, drawn to the combination of luxury and tragedy, and the image they produced was heavily sentimentalized. A beautiful, doomed woman in a white dress, her hair already whitening, her eyes already seeing the end. In the early 20th century, a more sceptical generation reinterpreted her as a symbol of aristocratic blindness, of the ruling class's inability to see the suffering it caused. More recently, historians have worked carefully to peel back the accumulated layers of myth and find the actual person underneath, and what they have found is more interesting and more sympathetic than most of the legends. She was sharper than the sentimental version. She was kinder than the villain version. She was more frightened, more funny, more capable of self-awareness, more genuinely loving in her private relationships than almost any of the popular versions allow. She was also, at various times in her life, genuinely at fault. She spent too freely in years when France could not afford it, even if the sums were smaller than the legend suggests. She misjudged some of her friendships. She was politically naive in ways that had real consequences. She was human, in other words, with the full, complicated interior that being human requires. And she lived that human life inside one of the most extraordinary settings that any human has ever inhabited. And the collision between the ordinary person and the extraordinary setting is what makes her story still speak to people 2.5 centuries after it ended. What the palace actually remembers is harder to describe. There is a quality familiar to anyone who has spent time in buildings of great age and great historical weight that is not quite atmosphere and not quite presence, but is something in between. Not a ghost, not anything supernatural, simply the accumulated residue of time, of lives lived, of ordinary human hours piled up in the same rooms for generation after generation, until the rooms themselves seem to carry something of all that living. The walls of the Queen's chamber have been rehung with reproductions of fabrics she chose. The carved marble chimney-piece is original. The gilded cornices above the windows have been there since before she arrived. She would recognise it. Whether recognition is the same as remembrance is a philosophical question. But standing in that room in the late afternoon, when the light comes in low from the garden-facing windows and catches the mirrors along the wall and throws quiet gold across the floor, standing there, you can feel the distance between what the room was and what it is now,
and it is not as large a distance as you might expect. The stone is the same, the view from the window is the same, the quality of the light is the same.
She looked at this light. She breathed this air. She walked on these floors, or floors very close to them, in the mornings and the evenings, and the long nights when sleep was difficult, and the palace was never fully quiet, and the world outside was changing in ways she couldn't quite see yet. She was not a monster. She was not a saint. She was a woman, caught in a role she had been assigned before she was old enough to understand it, doing her imperfect best in an impossible situation, finding her genuine joys where she could, in music, in her children, in the gardens, in the small escapes of the Trianon and the Hameau, and bearing her burdens with a composure that, in the end, was one of the most remarkable things about her. Napoleon said her death dated from the diamond necklace trial. He may have been right about the political mechanics, but Marie Antoinette herself, the actual woman, not the symbol, dated herself from the same moment all of us do, from the first breath, from the beginning. From a morning in Vienna, when a fair-haired girl opened her eyes and found herself already in the middle of a story that had begun before she arrived and would continue long after she left. The gardens are quiet tonight. The fountains are stilled. The gravel paths lie pale under the stars. The hedges stand in their perfect rows, dark against the darker sky. And the palace, all those hundreds of rooms, all those thousands of windows, holds its silence the way old things hold things, without effort, without sentiment, simply because silence is what remains when the voices are gone. Let the image of it rest in your mind as you drift, the long golden corridor of the Hall of Mirrors, dark now, filled with shadow and the depth of its own reflections. The Queen's chamber, quiet, the carved marble gleaming faintly in the dark. The garden stretching away to the horizon, silver and still under the night sky. She walked there. She breathed there. She was there. And in some way that is older than history and quieter than memory, she is there still. Let the palace darken around you as you sink into rest. Let the fountains fall silent. Let the candles in your imagination burn down slowly to their bases and go out, one by one, until only the starlight remains on the long gravel paths and the silver reflecting pools. You have travelled a long way tonight, from Vienna to Versailles, from a 14-year-old girl in a borrowed carriage to a queen who stood on a balcony and curtsied to a crowd that wanted her gone, and found in that single graceful gesture something that no revolution could entirely account for. You have walked through gilded rooms and English gardens and fairy-tale villages, and the long, difficult years of a life that was stranger and harder and quieter and more human than the legend usually allows. Rest now. Let the images settle like dust in old rooms. The Hall of Mirrors, the morning ceremony, the Hameau in summer,
the gravel cooling in the evening air. Sleep if you are ready. History will be here in the morning.
And if this story helped you find a little peace tonight, I would be so grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly means the world to me, and it helps this little channel continue doing what it was made to do, finding the quiet corners of history and bringing them to you, slowly, in the dark, for the hours when sleep is near and the world can wait. Good night. And if you are still awake enough to hear this, if sleep is being stubborn tonight, if the mind is still running through its lists and worries, and the small anxieties that the dark has a way of amplifying, then let me offer you this as a final thought to carry into rest. Marie Antoinette spent 20 years inside those gilded rooms, performing her life for thousands of watching eyes, and in all that time, the thing she most clearly wanted was the simplest thing in the world. She wanted a quiet evening with people she loved. She wanted to walk in a garden without being observed. She wanted to read a book without someone waiting to report what she had chosen. She wanted to sit beside water and hear nothing except the water. Most of those things were available to her only in small doses, stolen between duties, available only because she had built their containers carefully. The Trianon, the hameau, the private apartments, the evening hours when the official day finally ran out. But she found them. She claimed them in whatever imperfect form was available to her.
You have none of her constraints tonight. The evening is yours. The quiet is yours. You have earned your rest the way all ordinary people earn it, by living through the day, which is its own kind of performance, its own set of roles and expectations, and moments when you had to hold yourself together by sheer intention. The day is over now. The lights are low. Nothing is required of you. Let the palace fade. Let Versailles grow distant, a pale shape on a horizon that is slowly dissolving into dark. Let the fountains stop their long silver arcing and settle back into their basins. Let the candles in the hall of mirrors burn out one by one until only your reflection remains in the dark glass, and then let even that go softly into sleep. You have been there tonight. You have walked those halls. You have stood in the gardens in the evening light, smelling box hedge and water and the far-off green of the royal forest. You have been, for a little while, inside one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the world. Now come home. Rest. The story will keep. It always does.